Okay, now that we're done with our warm-up activity, we're going to move into our lesson. Today's lesson, if you look up on the board, is clearly the road to war. And of course, as always, I'm Mr. Rogers. Go ahead, you can clap if you'd like. Give me a round of applause. Okay, first things first, as always, we're going to start with a little bit of a focused review. What is totalitarianism? Good. It is a government that takes total centralized state control over every aspect of public and private life. Remember, the biggie was the private life. We had looked at absolute monarchs earlier in the year. The biggest difference between totalitarianism and absolutism would be probably in that private life chunk. Um, Absolute rulers took control of public life, but rarely would they try to take control of private life. Totalitarian governments, they do take control over even your private life, things that happen in your own life, in your own home, so on and so forth. Okay, what are the key traits of totalitarianism? This was that little chart that I had in our PowerPoint that we reviewed before you did your totalitarian graphic timeline. It was that chart that was from the textbook, and you should have completed a graphic organizer on this as well. Good. It is all of those things. State control of individuals. They have modern technology. They have a dynamic, charismatic leader. They have state control of society as a whole. They have a specific ideology. Think about the communists and communism or Marxism. That's a particular ideology. Or the Nazis with their particular brand of anti Semitism or hatred towards the Jews. They also have a method of enforcement. Remember, we looked at like the secret police. We said that Russia had the KGB and the Nazis had the Gestapo. And they generally have a dictatorship and one party rule. Remember, the contemporary example we were talking about was North Korea. And although North Korea is not necessarily a dictatorship in the sense that Kim Jong un received his power from birth, not from necessarily being a strong man, which is typically what you'll see in a dictatorship. Okay, so lastly, what was the Great Purge? What was the Great Purge? Good. It was a campaign of terror directed at the enemies of Stalin. A campaign of terror directed at the enemies of Stalin. Okay. So, what are we going to be answering today? What is our essential question? We are going to be trying to answer what countries were most prepared for the impending war. So, if you remember from the totalitarian project you did from the graphic timeline, uh, most countries were thrown into upheaval after World War One. We had the onset of a depression, which allowed a lot of these strong men to take control of the government. And then what did they do after they took control of this government? They began preparing for war. They began preparing for war. So we're going to look at what countries were most prepared to actually fight a war, another global conflict. Because remember, a lot of people, after the Treaty of Versailles was signed in 1919, knew pretty much the writing was on the wall. They knew there was going to be another global conflict. That global conflict is going to be referred to as World War II. Okay, so that's going to be our essential question. What countries were most prepared for the impending war? So as we start going through the activity in this lesson, keep that in mind. I might even point you back to it from time to time. Okay, so how are we going to answer that question today? We are going to be doing a stations activity. Okay? We will be placed in groups of 3. You will quietly read the source and annotate it. Now, you can't read all of the sources in the traditional sense. Some of these sources are going to be charts, and those charts we're not going to read the same way we're going to read text, but like we do sometimes in this class too, we can read film as text. So we're going to be reading it, just not in the traditional sense. And then we got to annotate them all. We can annotate charts too. We need to just write down important ideas, important concepts that we see inside the chart, or even questions you might have. Groups are then going to discuss what they have just read or examined in the case of a chart, and they're going to answer the DBQs. After a few minutes, we will move on to the next station. There will be 5 stations in total. We will be done after every group has gone to every station once. Okay, how are you going to be grouped? So grouping, as I said before, we're going to be placed in groups of 3. I will begin a countdown with 1, and I will count all the way through 5. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so on and so forth. The first 3 people with the same number will be a group. So the first 3 ones are a group. The first 3 twos, so on and so forth. That is only 15 students though. So at that point, we will restart the entire process, and I will begin counting 1 through 5 again, and the next group of 1s will be a group, and the next 3 2s will be a group, so on and so forth. Okay, now I will give you a moment to get with your groups, and we'll come back. Okay, good. Now that we're in our groups, what is going to be our responsibility? Every person in the group will have a role at every station. Every person must play each role at least once. What are the roles? There will be a leader, a reader, and a scribe. The leader's job will be to make sure that their group stays on task. The leader will also be responsible for making sure that all the materials get placed back into a pile before they leave the station. The reader, what is your duty, your responsibility? You are going to merely read the source. And then the scribe, what is your job going to be? To write the responses for the DBQs from your group. Now, when you're annotating, the reader or the scribe can choose to make the annotation marks, but you should be annotating it as a group. So read through it. When someone, after you read each little paragraph, maybe even sentence, however you want to do it, you guys should say, hey, is there any word we don't understand in there? If that's the case, we circle it, we highlight it, however you want to do it, whatever symbols you like to use. Remember, I showed you my symbols, but you can use yours. Okay, at this time, is there any questions, comments, or concerns? I want to reiterate, every person must play each role at least once. So everybody has to be a leader once, a reader once, and a scribe once. After you've done it once, you guys can decide who's going to take on those other roles at the other stations. All right, any questions, comments, or concerns at this time? Okay, moving on. Source readings, just like always, the steps to annotate. Step 1 is to know your symbols. Step 2 is to use your symbols. And lastly, step 3 is to summarize what you just read. In this case, it's the brief little paragraph, not the entire thing. And that's because that's part of step 4. The end is nigh. The end is near. After reading the text, we should begin to organize our vocabulary, our thoughts, and our arguments. The vocabulary. If you come across any vocabulary words you don't understand, we need to locate a synonym or a definition for each word. We can do this by asking another group that's nearby you. You could do this by getting a dictionary out of my cabinet. You could do this by looking up the definition on your smartphone, or a last resort, you could raise your hand and ask me. Thoughts. Review what you wrote in the margins. Review your annotation. What did you do in the marginalia? It's always important to go back and look at that. Arguments. Develop your overall arguments for the text and find evidence to support them. So remember, an argument is simply referred to as a claim, and like any good claim, you must find evidence in the text to support that claim. And then lastly, we need to provide a summary, overall summary of what we read in its entirety. So in this case, normally summaries, I want you to write a paragraph, but some of the text you're looking at is only a paragraph, so I don't expect you to write an entire paragraph. You could probably get away with just writing maybe one or two sentences. And this differs from just writing a summary on one or two little sentences within the text. So is there any questions, comments, or concerns at this time? Okay, good. The DBQs. DBQ simply means document-based questions. Like always, you will answer the document-based question for each source. Most of these answers can be found directly in the text. Some answers require you to interpret the text. Other answers require you to connect different parts of the text. And very seldom will these answers require you to connect prior knowledge of themes or concepts that we've learned previously in the year, in the unit, so on and so forth, with the text that you are engaged in currently. Okay? Is there any questions, comments, or concerns at this time? Okay, moving on. We are literally going to get into the station activity. If you look up here, I have round 1, round 2, round 3, round 4. I will click on those hyperlinks. It will take us to a countdown clock. When you hear the chime, the bell, the buzzer, the explosion, whatever weird, fancy little chime I'm using this time, when you hear that sound go off, that means it's time to put all the materials back into a pile as the leader. Everyone else pick up your stuff, move on to the next station. Our directions are really only twofold. We should read or examine the source, and then we should answer the questions. But remember, anytime you read or examine a source in this class, I know you've probably heard it a million times, we should be annotating. And then when we're done with that, we should begin answering the document-based questions. I'm only going to give you about 6 minutes, exactly 6 minutes per round. So don't waste your time. Leaders, it's your responsibility to make sure your group stays on task. So at this time, I'm going to hit round 1, and then you're going to be off to the races.